Monica Snyder has a Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Biology from UC Berkeley and a Master's in Forensic Science from UC Davis. She's an atheist and is a co-lead in the secular pro-life movement for over a decade. And just in case you haven't heard of it, the secular pro-life works to advance secular arguments against abortion. So they're part of the pro-life tent. And so I want to encourage us that together we advocate. This pro-life movement is a big tent, and it includes everyone. People coming from a religious perspective, people coming from a secular perspective. So we're here to learn today, and she's going to talk to us about deconstructing 3 pro-life myths.
Can everybody hear me okay? I'm deconstructing 3 pro-choice myths.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. And as she said, my name is Monica Snyder. I'm an atheist. I have been working with secular pro-life for about 10 years. And in that time, I have had countless conversations about abortion, some of them more useful than others. I understand having conversations where we have different philosophical or ethical or religious views, and we're trying to find out how do we understand fetal value and how do we understand bodily autonomy, and we're trying to connect with people on that. I understand those kinds of conversations, but the conversations I find more frustrating are when we can't even get to that point because we don't share the same facts. And so I designed this presentation largely to look at some of the most ubiquitous false facts that come up literally on basically a daily basis in my work with secular pro-life, and try and explain why these myths, these pro-choice myths, are very pervasive and not actually true. And so to be very clear, everything I'm going to show you, it has nothing to do with opinion. It has nothing to do with how you feel about abortion or pregnancy. This is just verifiable information that people get incorrect, and then they use it to inform their position. So I'm just going to get started. Oh, this is why I put this slide in, because I knew I was going to forget this. There are a ton of sources for my presentation. We have printed out handouts that list all of the sources at little podiums when you leave today if you want to review any of them. But if you don't grab a handout, you can also go to this URL. That's our blog. And this morning, I posted this blog post which lists every single source for this presentation, and all the ones that are available online, you can just click on it and go right to the source. So if I say anything today that you want to know more about, I have so much more information about everything I'm going to tell you than I have time for today, and if you want to read for hours, it's all right there. Okay. First myth is that we don't know when human life begins. You see articles like this that act as if the pro-life side is being really simplistic and reductive about a very nuanced, complicated issue. And they act as if we're trying to just be black and white, and we don't really understand the very complicated biology here. And before I explain why this is a myth, I want to make a very important distinction. When I talk about when a human life begins, am I talking about in terms of biology or philosophy? Am I talking about when does an organism start, or am I talking about when is a human life morally relevant? This is a very important distinction that people on both sides of the debate fail to make all the time, and so I'm going to spend a minute explaining it. The pro-life view, very vaguely in a nutshell, is that the human zygote or embryo or fetus is a human organism. We argue that all human organisms are morally relevant, that is, they have value, they're worth protecting. Some would say that's what you call people. It's generally immoral to kill people, so abortion is generally immoral. There's your premise, conclusion. But it's really important to understand that these are not all the same type of claim. The first one is a scientific claim. It is a fact that the human fetus is a human organism. But these second two are philosophical claims. Science cannot tell you who is or isn't morally relevant. Science can't tell you what is or is not a morally good action to take. Those are arguments based on philosophy and your religious views and your ethical point of view. And we can have that debate, and it's a very important debate. But first we have to recognize that these are different debates. And this matters because what I see happen all the time, on our side as well as theirs, is the pro-life person will just skip the middle part. And they'll just say, science says life starts at conception, so abortion is wrong. And what you're doing there is kind of wrapping everything into one sentence, and it's a little confusing. So, for example, let's say you're having coffee with your pro-choice friend, and for some reason they ask you why you're against abortion, and so you say, well, life begins at conception. And maybe what you mean is, in terms of biology, the first stage of our life cycle as an organism is a zygote, starts at conception. But they hear people begin at conception. They think you mean valuable human life worth protecting, which you do, but that's like an additional argument. They think you're saying people begin at conception. And so they might respond, well, science can't say when life begins. But they mean science can't do philosophy's job. Science can't say when an organism is morally relevant. But you hear, they don't understand biology. Of course science can say when life begins. And it's just a miscommunication. It's just a lack of clarity in the conversation, but it wastes a lot of time. The reason I'm spending so much time explaining this distinction, biology versus philosophy, and how it's a miscommunication and it's an innocent mistake, that's not this. These are not innocent mistakes. These articles, which are in your sources handout, they are claiming that in terms of biology specifically, not philosophy, biology, we're wrong. They're not saying, yes, of course, we all begin as zygotes, but philosophically, why does that matter? They're saying we don't understand science. Every single one of these articles is talking about touting scientific credentials and then claiming we have the biology wrong. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll give you an example. This article came out during the last election cycle, and the author, Scott Gilbert, was really irritated because Republicans kept saying things like life begins at conception. And so in this article, he says, as an embryologist and the author of embryological textbooks, I can say with absolute assurance, there is no consensus among embryologists as to when an individual human life begins. And I want you to notice two things about this quote. First, he's touting scientific credentials. As an embryologist, no consensus among embryologists. So it's possible that he means there's no consensus as to when philosophically valuable life begins, but then why is he talking about being an embryologist? Nobody goes to embryologists to ask what they think of philosophy. It's not their job. He's touting scientific credentials here. And it's important, and I bolded it, he says individual human life. And the reason that's important is because a lot of times when I have this conversation about when life begins, people will say, well, life is a continuum. There's no beginning or end. It goes in cycles, and you can trace us back through evolution, back to when our atoms came from stardust. That's cool. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about individual, it goes in cycles, and the beginning of each one of those cycles is the zygote. But he's not even saying that. He's saying in terms of an individual human life, we still don't know when it starts. He's making a very strong claim. And if you read this article, he argues that embryologists, not just everyday people, but specifically embryologists, have sort of 5 different possible points of view on when life begins in terms of biology. The first one is, of course, conception, and he acknowledges that there are a lot of people in the sciences who say life begins at conception. He cites a bunch of them, including a pro-choice geneticist and other people. Okay, so he's like, yes, that is one possible view. He's not ignoring it. The next one he says is gastrulation, which is when the embryo has gotten to the point where it can no longer twin. It's individualized. It can't become monozygotic twins, and so maybe you could argue only now do you have an individual. Now, who does he cite that says gastrulation is the beginning of life? He cites one person, and the quote doesn't actually support what he's saying. The person says, it is not birth, marriage, or death, but gastrulation, which is the most important time in your life. So even the person he cites doesn't say that's the beginning of your life in terms of biology. You just say gastrulation is really important. That's all he has for that one. Then he says that some embryologists think your life doesn't start until human-specific EEG waves. He cites nobody. Then he says some embryologists, in terms of embryology, say that human life doesn't begin until birth. And he cites nobody, because nobody says that. And then he says that some people say, I don't want to answer this question because you're just trying to trick me into explaining when the soul enters the body, which is totally presumptuous. But the point is, even in his own article, when you actually read it, and he claims there's no consensus and it's really confusing, actually what he says is a whole lot of people say conception. One person kind of not really says gastrulation, and one person says they don't want to talk about it. But it gets much worse than that. So he is the author of embryological textbooks. This is one of them, Developmental Biology, 6th edition. And in this book, the same person, Scott Gilbert, says, when we consider a dog, for instance, we usually picture an adult. But the dog is a dog from the moment of fertilization of a dog egg by a dog sperm. It remains a dog even as a senescent dying hound. Therefore, the dog is actually the entire life cycle of the animal from fertilization through death. In a more recent version of the same book, he has a chapter called Fertilization, the beginning of a new organism. And he says fertilization accomplishes 2 separate ends. Sex the combining of genes derived from two parents, and reproduction, the generation of a new organism. So when Scott Gilbert is writing scientific texts, he says that fertilization generates a new organism, and individuals are individuals from fertilization through death. And if you read these books, which I own and have looked at, he doesn't say, I'm asserting one view, but embryologists are really divided about this and you should be aware of these other perspectives. You know why he doesn't say that? Because they're not divided about this. Not in terms of the science. It's very likely true that embryologists are divided in terms of their political opinions, I have no doubt. But that's not what we're asking them, is it? I didn't ask for your political opinion, I asked what the biology says. And it's not just his own textbooks that contradict his political opinions, it's countless textbooks. This is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just examples. They're all in the sources handout, and the sources handout includes the quotes from each one that says the mammalian life cycle or the human life cycle begins with the zygote, or they'll say with conception or fertilization, but same idea. And these are written by different people over the course of decades. This is not new information and it's not anti-choice propaganda. This is basic biology and it's been known for a very long time. And I want to point out too, while I'm talking about this, when you step outside the abortion debate, this is not a controversial idea. The idea that we begin as zygotes is readily accepted in biology when we're not specifically talking about abortion. So here's a couple examples. This is my daughter's ABCs of Science board book. And I couldn't help but notice that Z is for zygote, the first developmental stage for living things. And obviously a children's board book isn't like peer-reviewed research that you could cite as an authority. I'm just saying, in terms of sort of colloquial understanding of this, it's readily accepted. Here's another example. If you've never seen the YouTube channel Crash Course, I strongly recommend it. And one of their series is on biology, and this particular video is on meiosis, sexual reproduction. And the speaker, Hank Green, says, if you're not suitably impressed by the fact that we all come from one single cell and then we become this, then just, I don't know how to impress you. And here's a picture I took in late 2018 when my husband and I went to Chicago to the Museum of Science and Industry, and they have an entire section on fetal development, and outside of that section they have a plaque that says, all of us start as a single cell and then begin a wondrous journey of change in and with our moms. So when we're teaching biology and when we're talking about biology, not politics, this is just readily accepted. It's not a big deal. But suddenly when we walk into the abortion debate, I say the same thing and people claim I am pushing my religious beliefs on them. They don't know I'm an atheist when they say that, but that's what they say. And recently, lest that not be enough, all the embryology and biology textbooks and all the colloquial examples. Just in late 2018, out of the University of Chicago, this guy, Steve Jacobs, did a dissertation on this. He noticed when he was having discussions about abortion, that same conflation that I was talking to you about before. Are we talking about biology or philosophy? How come all these conversations to go nowhere? And so he surveyed Americans on this question. He surveyed about 2,900 American adults, and he asked them, do you think this is an important question? And 87% said yes. Specifically in terms of the abortion debate, is this an important question? When does human life begin in terms of the abortion debate? And the vast majority are like, yes, it's an important question. And then he said, well, do you think that we deserve to know the answer for making decisions about our reproductive health? i.e., if you're going to get an abortion or not, or other decisions too. And 84% said, yeah, we deserve to know the answer to this important question in terms of the abortion debate and in terms of our reproductive decisions. So then he said, okay, and this is the important part, because he's trying to figure out, do they mean biology or philosophy? Who do you think would be the best authority to answer this question? And he gave them multiple options. He said you could pick the Supreme Court, voters, philosophers, religious leaders, or biologists. Because he's trying to find out, like, if you think this is a philosophical question, presumably you will pick philosophers or religious leaders to help you decide when is human life valuable. In fact, in Roe v. Wade, when the Supreme Court gave their infamous decision, they talked about how religious leaders over the centuries have had different ideas about this. So he asked them, and the overwhelming majority said biologists. They said this is an important question that's relevant to the abortion debate, and biologists are the ones to answer it. So he said, okay, well then I will ask biologists. So he surveyed 5,500 biologists over 1,000 academic institutions around the world, and it's important to note that in this group, 63% were non-religious, 85% described themselves as pro-choice, and over 95% held PhDs. And the reason I bring this up is because you can't possibly argue that the group that he was surveying was going to be biased for our position. So what he did was he gave them 3 statements and said, rate these as correct or incorrect. First statement, the end product of mammalian fertilization is a fertilized egg, zygote, a new mammalian organism in the first stage of its species life cycle with its species genome. And 91% said this is correct. Second statement, the development of a mammal begins with fertilization, a process by which the spermatozoon from the male and the oocyte from the female unite to give rise to a new organism, the zygote. And 88% said, yeah, that's correct. Now, he called these his implicit statements because they're worded in a very technical, scientific way. We're just talking about science. We're not talking about anything else. But to sort of test where the breakdown happens, he created what I'm going to show you in a second, what he called his explicit statement, where he worded it a little bit differently, a little bit more casually, maybe. And he purposely did it this way to see if it started to trigger their philosophical and political sensibilities. Even though he's asking them as biologists about biology, he's trying to see where the breakdown happens. So his explicit statement said, in developmental biology, so he's still talking about biology, fertilization marks the beginning of a human's life. You see how that's more direct. And he said, since the process produces an organism with a human genome that has begun to develop in the first stage of the human's life cycle. And here, 75% said this is correct. 2 things to notice. The number went down. Less people, less biologists, fewer biologists said that this was correct. And he believes, Jacobs believes, it's because he phrased it differently and now they're starting to think about the abortion debate or other bioethical issues. The second thing to notice is still the vast majority said it was correct. And this is from a mostly non-religious pro-choice group of biologists. And they still said, yes, the beginning of a human's life is fertilization. So then he broke down their answer by their political persuasion. This is their own descriptions of themselves. And not very surprising, the more pro-choice they were, the less likely they were to agree that a human life begins at fertilization. But even with that being the case, even the biologists who said that they were very pro-choice, by a huge margin, agreed that a human's life begins at fertilization. And if you count all the biologists, regardless of their political position, the margin went much, much higher. In other words, you see these articles trying to call us anti-science and ignorant and reductive, but these don't hold any weight compared to decades of biological and embryological knowledge and text and the consensus of biologists internationally. So if you are having these conversations and people are pushing back on this, be confident. We are correct about this. I'm not saying this settles the entire debate because the philosophical parts still matter a great deal. You still have to talk about fetal value and personhood. That's important. But before you can talk about that, we have to agree about what we're talking about. And we are talking about a human organism. We are talking about biologically a human being. Whether you think that matters or not, important conversation, but we are right about the biology. That's the first myth. Oh, thank you. Okay, second myth. Most or all late-term abortions are medically necessary. So when late-term abortion comes up in politics, for example, last year when New York was liberalizing its late-term abortion law, or especially during presidential elections, it's going to keep coming up, you see articles like this. And I want to take a moment and point out, so the articles I showed you before about when life begins, you don't need to read those. They're garbage. But these articles, I think pro-life people should read. These are tough situations. I'm not telling you what you have to think about them, but you should be aware that they happen and you should wrestle with them. Every single one of these stories, and some of them include multiple stories, is of a woman with a wanted pregnancy, sometimes a very wanted pregnancy, who gets a horrifying diagnosis. And I don't mean something life compatible that's just intimidating, like Down syndrome. I mean something that is much, much more serious and physically debilitating or life-threatening. And they make a heartbreaking choice. They're basically using abortion like euthanasia, right? That's not the myth. These are true stories. These do happen. The myth is that these represent most late-term abortions. And so I've got to the point now where if they even have the phrase late-term abortion in the title, I already know the article is going to be this story, right? Now, before I continue, I need to define the term late-term abortion. It's not a technical term. There's a lot of different ideas about it. And recently, in the last year or two, I've noticed that pro-choice people are starting to accuse our side of making this term up to be confusing, which is not true. It's been used for decades by both sides, but whatever. So I want to be very clear what I'm talking about. When I say late-term abortion, some people think it means anything after the first trimester. Some people think it means anything after 21 weeks, that being important mostly because abortion statistics break down that way. You have the first trimester, first half of the second trimester, And then after 21 weeks, laser pointer, okay. So some people think it means anything after viability, which is not exactly, but roughly 24 weeks. And by the way, every gestational age I'm talking about, this is 24 weeks after fertilization. I'm not talking about LMP, I'm talking about post-fertilization. So some people think late term is anything after viability. And some people think it should only be the third trimester, like maybe it's early term, midterm, late term. And rather than try to give you an argument about what I think it should be, I read all those stories that I just showed you, and I just marked where they were. So they're talking about their late term abortions, and that's how far along they were. So presumably they think that's a late term abortion. So for the purposes of this talk, and in general when I talk about this, when I say late term abortion, I mean anything after 21 weeks. So a little over halfway through the second trimester. It's important to understand that non-medical late-term abortion is not illegal everywhere. A lot of people on both sides think that. I get that all the time. Well, you can't get it unless there's a medical emergency. That is false. So to break it down very clearly, and I got all this data from the Guttmacher Institute. If you're not familiar with them, they are abortion rights advocacy group, so there's no way there's bias to it. Like, not bias for our side anyway. The earliest one, Mississippi, they outlaw non-medical or elective abortion after 18 weeks. Then there are a bunch that do it at 20 weeks, presumably for fetal pain legislation. And so all of these states, you can get an elective abortion anywhere up to 20 weeks, and then after that, you have to have a medical reason. Then there are a few that do it at 22 weeks, a bunch that do it at viability, and there are actually 8 states where you can get a non-medical abortion after viability. In case you didn't already know, viability is when the fetus has a 50-50% chance of surviving if born. And every week after viability, that chance increases significantly. And yet there are 8 states where you can still get an abortion for non-medical reasons after viability. These are the 7 where you can get it any time in the entire pregnancy. To be quite clear, in these 7 states, yes, including Oregon, you can get an abortion for any reason at any time in the entire pregnancy. So when people tell you that we're making a big deal out of nothing because this never happens, and when it does, it's only for medical emergencies, certainly on a legal basis, that is not true. So it's 32 states where you can get a late-term abortion for non-medical reasons legally. They all have exceptions. There are some where even after they have their restriction, if there's a problem with the fetal health, you can get an abortion. 27 states if there's a problem with the mother's physical health. 14 more if her mental or emotional health is threatened. So when they say medical, they have different ideas about this. They could, if her emotional or mental health is threatened, they will call that a medical abortion. And all of them if her life is in danger. So when we have debates about late-term abortion and people say, well, what if her life is in danger? That's already true. Every single state, you can get a late-term medically necessary abortion if her life is in danger. That's not what the debate is about. Also, just FYI, this is what it would look like if the states were free to make their own legislation. The green lines are all places, and these are the states we're talking about, where they tried to pass more restrictive laws and they got overturned or enjoined because they go up against Roe v. Wade. So if Roe v. Wade ever did get overturned, this is sort of the divergence you would start to see among the different kinds of subcultures within the country. Alabama and Utah would just be like, nope, done. And then at 6 weeks and is that right? No, sorry, 4 weeks and 6 weeks, that's the heartbeat bills that have started to come up. Or once you can detect a heartbeat via ultrasound, then they would outlaw it. But the green lines are all not enforced because they directly contradict Roe v. Wade. So just so you know. That's the legal status. It's important to understand that there are so many places in the country where you can get a non-medical late-term abortion because Americans do not like elective late-term abortion at all. So when you look at these headlines, I thought this one in the upper left was funny because it said millennials have a surprising view on later-term abortions. It shouldn't be surprising. Poll after poll after poll finds if you ask Americans about how far along the pregnancy is, the support drops dramatically as it goes on for millennials and for everybody else. So I'm going to give you some examples. Here's a Gallup poll from 2018. It said, when should abortion be legal generally? And you can see it drops off hugely as it goes on. I forget the exact numbers here, but I think it was something like 15% said, yes, in the 3rd trimester it should still be legal, compared to over half in the 1st. Same thing here. A Marist poll from 2018 said, which one of these comes closest to your view? Abortion should be legal in the first 3 months, in the first 6 months, or any time. And one of the things I wanted you to notice here is the white columns are just pro-choice people. So even pro-choice people, they're much more likely to say legal in the first 3 months, and then after that, they don't agree as much. This isn't just a pro-life person thing. Excuse me. Same thing here. What if there was a 20-week ban? We talk about fetal pain legislation and banning abortion after 20 weeks because after that the fetus can feel pain. And what's interesting about this is even most pro-choice people are more likely to support that than oppose it. If it gets further on in the pregnancy, people get very uncomfortable. However, Americans are very supportive of medically necessary abortion. So here, Gallup asked in 2013, what would be a sufficient reason just in the 3rd trimester, so very late, what would be a good enough reason to have abortion be legal? And maybe a third of people said if she can't afford the child, it should be legal. But it went up a lot once there was a problem with fetal health, fetal impairment right there, and much more if there was a problem with her health, then people are very supportive even in the 3rd trimester. Same thing here, same idea. 2018 Gallup poll, they said in the 3rd trimester only, should it be legal for any reason? And I think it was like 20% said yes. Then it went up to almost half when they asked if the woman had a life-impairing illness. And if her life was directly threatened, it was 75%. So you can see Americans are very supportive of medically necessary abortion. They're not that supportive of elective abortion, and they're definitely not supportive of late-term abortion, and they're definitely not supportive of late-term elective abortion. But they don't know the legal status. For the most part, they have no idea how common it is, or how accessible it is, I should say. Those stories I showed you earlier, I was saying it's always the same story. It's a woman with a very wanted pregnancy, heartbreaking diagnosis, and then she gets an abortion. And then she bravely tells her story. I'm not being glib. It takes nerve to tell a story like that. And people say, see, this is why we need it. This is the opposite. This is the only time so far in my pro-life advocacy over the last 10 years, this is the only story I have seen where a woman comes out and talks about her non-medical late-term abortion. And it's important that you know about this because when this story came out, which was after I first made this presentation, I was shocked. This woman didn't know she was pregnant until 26 weeks, which is not as ridiculous as people act like it is. It depends on certain health conditions and things that can mask the pregnancy. She just didn't know. So she finds out at 26 weeks, which is getting very near almost the end of the 2nd trimester. And by that point, she lived in Oregon. I think she still lives in Oregon. Even though in Oregon you can get an abortion at any time for any reason legally, it doesn't mean it's easy to do because providers don't like to do it. If it's not for medical necessity, a lot of them don't want to mess with it. It's complicated, there's liability issues, it's also harder on them psychologically and emotionally. They're humans too. And so even though she lived in Oregon where you guys don't even have gestational limits, she was struggling to find someone to give her a non-medical abortion after 26 weeks. So she raised $12,000 with the help of funds that help women get abortions, and she went to New Mexico and did it. There's no mention in her story of any problem with her health or the child's health. I was shocked when I read this, not because she did it. I know that this happens, but because they published it. And sure enough, when they did, look at the responses. I went and found their Facebook page just to see what people were saying, because part of me was like, see? And I went to look, and people were really angry. And these are pro-choice people. Here's an example. Please don't use examples like this as some form of advocacy. It actually harms the cause. The article was a poor example and only puts fuel on the fire of the disinformation campaign from the religious right. This story was useless in making any valid points about late-term medically necessary abortions. Where are all the other stories that more accurately reflect why women sometimes find themselves needing a late-term abortion? And I'm not saying this to make fun of these people. The myth I was talking about before, where embryologists say we don't know when life begins, they know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. I think this myth is purported innocently. I think humans respond to really emotional, compelling stories. And at some point, lots of people hear those really heartbreaking, basically abortion, euthanasia stories, and they're really moved and horrified by them, especially if they have kids. And you imagine, what if it was me, right? They're coming from a place of empathy when they talk about late-term abortion. And it's ubiquitous to act as if, or directly say, that late-term abortions are only for medically necessary reasons. You have powerful voices directly saying this all the time. When Hillary Clinton was running for president, she said it multiple times. ACOG, the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they're put out in the media as this neutral arbiter of facts. They say it too. People say it all the time with no data to back it up, and people believe them because one, you want to believe it, and two, you want to protect the women that you feel like were in this heartbreaking situation. So then you read a story like this, they're not saying, shh, don't talk about it. We all know this is true, but don't say it. I think they're saying this harms the cause because most of them aren't like this. They really believe that. And unfortunately, that's not true. The other reason this myth is purported innocently is because you hear all these really emotionally compelling stories and they stick with you. and then there's nothing to combat them. There's no data. And it's not just because people are hiding the data. There's actually very little data. It took me a long time and a lot of work with help of some very intelligent people that also have access to a lot of information before I could find almost any data on this. And it's not surprising. I don't think it's really a conspiracy. Relative to early-term abortion, late-term abortion is comparatively rare. It's like 1.3% of abortions happen after 21 weeks. So already you have a smaller sample set to draw from. It's also highly stigmatized. People don't even want to talk about their medically necessary late-term abortions. I've read stories of women who spoke anonymously and they didn't tell anyone. They said they had a stillbirth or something. They're certainly not going to talk about their non-medically necessary late-term abortions. So you've got a smaller sample set of a highly stigmatized situation. It's hard to find data on it. So then you have these really emotionally compelling stories on one side and crickets. It makes sense that people believe this. I think this is an innocent misunderstanding for most people. Maybe not Hillary Clinton, but most people. But there is some data on it. Hard to find, but I'm going to go over it with you just so you see where I'm coming from. This publication came out in the Perspectives on Sexual and Reproductive Health. It was done by Guttmacher researchers, so again, abortion advocacy people. And if you open this publication and you go to this page and you open Table 6, it will talk about the percentage of women seeking abortion because of health concerns. Please note the word concerns. They may have had a real health problem or not, but they were worried that they did. And if you read the paper, it talks about this openly. Like, for example, one thing that counted as a health concern is if she was pregnant and she didn't know she'd get good prenatal care. That counted as a health concern. So this is a very broad catch-all for any possible health issues, okay? And if you go to the bottom of the table, it breaks it down by how far along they were. And the furthest they go is after the first trimester. So after 13 weeks, 21% cited a fetal health concern and 10% cited a personal health concern. Now, it's possible that some of these women cited both, and so there'd be some overlap there. But just to be conservative, I assumed they were all separate. And so if you look at that by like a pie chart, that means that in the first trimester, 75% of them didn't even have a concern about health at all, in any way. And then after the first trimester, it was a little bit different, but not a lot different. 69% still didn't even have a concern about health. This idea that nobody would get a later abortion except for medically necessary reasons starts to go down, but you see I'm only talking about after 13 weeks, not 21, right? So I was really curious what it would look like if you could go to 21, but this paper doesn't do that. Very hard to find, just like for the reasons I just told you. However, the state of Arizona does collect statistics on this. And if you didn't already know, states are not required to collect this kind of information, and they're not required to report it. Some states choose to, some states don't. It's another reason this is really hard to get information on. But Arizona does. And they break down their information by these time periods and for health reasons. So there's two trends I want you to notice here. First, look at the difference between these pie charts. When we're talking about any possible health concern, and when we're assuming there's no overlap between fetal and maternal health concern, you have this huge chunk. But when you're talking about actual medical problems, look at the difference. In the first trimester, you go from 25% maybe had some kind of health concern, less than 0.5% had an actual health problem when they got their abortion in the first trimester. And same thing with the first part of the second trimester. It gets larger, but it's still less than 10%. And then when you get to 21 weeks or later, there's two things I want you to notice. The first one is it does get larger. It is true. This is another reason this myth is so pervasive, because it is factually true that the further you go along in pregnancy, the more likely it is to be for a serious health reason. And people confuse more likely with majority. The second thing I want you to notice is that it's almost all for fetal health. The percentage of women with maternal health concerns is 1.6% in the beginning of the second trimester, 1.7% after that. The big difference here is fetal health. And that makes sense because there's a lot of health issues with the fetus that you cannot find out about until later in the pregnancy. But then the third thing I want you to notice is it's still not most of them, is it? Almost 80% of them are still not for health reasons. So it is true that it's more likely to be for health reasons, and it's also true that it's still not usually for health reasons, at least in Arizona. And this was from, I don't know if you caught it, 2012 to 2016, but I also checked the numbers for more recent years, and the trends have not changed. This is another publication that was useful. They didn't look at 21 weeks or later, they looked at 20 weeks or later, but it's the closest thing I could find. And they were looking at why women get abortions later instead of earlier. And the highlighted sections are, so it's ranked here for all women. This column is for women who were getting abortions 20 weeks or later. And so the most common reason they cited was they had trouble raising money for the procedure. And then they have this thing where they're sort of chasing the money, where they wanted to get it in the first trimester, they couldn't get enough money for that, and then it took so long that now they're so far along they need a more expensive procedure. And so I'm not saying that's unimportant, but it's not a health-related reason. Then there was almost a tie between the rest. They didn't know they were pregnant earlier. They weren't sure if they wanted to get an abortion, and they had it's sort of similar to the money, they had trouble getting insurance coverage. And we could argue about how important or not important these reasons are, but they're not health-related reasons. The women getting abortions after 20 weeks, these were some of the major reasons. You don't find out soon enough, you don't have the resources. Oh, let me back up before you read that. So then I wanted to see if we could find out what proportion in the third trimester. So I've been talking about 21 weeks or later. Third trimester is more like 27 weeks or later. What proportion of them were for non-medical reasons? Because now we're getting very rare and very expensive and dangerous. At this point, the abortion procedure is no less grueling than just giving birth, right? So you would hope that nobody would bother to do it unless it was for a medical emergency of some type. I couldn't find any quantifiable data on this at all, and I'm not surprised because of the reasons I told you. But there are only a handful of people in the country who will perform non-medical third trimester abortions and publicly talk about it. And I looked them up, and many of them, not many, several of them, have done interviews where they talk about it. So this is Susan Robinson out of New Mexico, and she talks about, like we were just saying, she sometimes gets people that come in the third trimester because they didn't know they were pregnant earlier. She says they think they just got pregnant. They have no idea they're in their 24th week. They make an appointment for an abortion. It takes a couple weeks. They have their ultrasound, and they find out they're at 27 weeks, which is too far for an abortion anywhere. So then what happens? They either give up, have the baby, or they go on the internet and they find us. She's talking about people who seek her out to get a third trimester abortion, not for medical reasons, but because they didn't know they were pregnant earlier. Her colleague, Dr. Shelley Sella, out of New Mexico also, this is an interview of her, so the interviewer is the one explaining what Sella told her, and she said the women Sella treats fall into two categories: those who discover fetal abnormalities and those with healthy, viable babies whose maternal circumstances mean they could not cope with the baby. And I don't mean this to be casual either. If you read this interview and she talks about some of those maternal circumstances, some of it is very, very serious, but she's still talking about aborting. Her words, Sella uses the word baby instead of fetus, which is why the interviewer does. And she says that sometimes it's healthy, viable babies because her heart goes out to the women in these circumstances. This is Warren Hearn out of Colorado. These are all states with no gestational limits on elective abortion. He doesn't share his clinic statistics and rarely speaks of individual cases, but Hearn has said he also performs late abortions for women who are not facing any grave medical outcome. So, when people tell you it's only for medical reasons, they're responding to emotionally compelling stories. They probably haven't spent nearly as much time as I did trying to find this very scant data. I get it. But the people doing this will tell you they do it. They fully admit it. And this doesn't give you an idea of proportion. I don't know how many third trimester abortions are non-medical, probably not many, but they do it and it's legal. I've shown these quotes to people before who didn't believe me, and then they said, well, they're not real doctors, they're charlatans. And I said, they haven't broken the law. What they're doing is not illegal, and you should be aware of that. You don't have to have a problem with it, but at least know that that's the reality. So when we talk about late-term abortion, understand that these stories, which I do think you should read, they're true stories, they do happen, but they do not represent most late-term abortions. And that's very relevant with a lot of the legislation. I don't know how many of you already are aware of this. Just recently when the Democrats voted against the Born Alive legislation, they talk about how these things never happen. They don't happen super often. Never is a pretty strong claim. They do happen. Okay, third myth, and this might be the most ubiquitous one. Abortion restrictions don't stop abortion. It's not just pro-choice people who tell me this. I have well-meaning pro-life people tell me this all the time. I'm pro-life, I want to help, I don't think we need to focus on the law because that doesn't really make any difference anyway, let's increase cultural support. And I am all for increasing social and cultural support. There's no downside to that. We should definitely do that. But it is a myth to think the law makes no difference. The law absolutely makes a difference. And so you see articles like this that talk about how if a woman wants an abortion, she will get one no matter what. You're not outlawing abortion, you're just outlawing safe abortion because now she's going to seek a really dangerous illegal abortion. If you really cared about decreasing abortion, you'd be promoting contraception and sex education. Which, first of all, why not both? I'm not going to get into that today, I'm just saying it's not mutually exclusive. I'm not going to get into the contraception thing, it's a whole separate issue, but I'm just here to say the law absolutely does decrease abortion rates. And so these articles, if you open them, every single one of them is referencing a Guttmacher report again. Here's an example of one such report. Guttmacher will look at abortion rates across the entire world and compare them. And here they said that their research confirms the lack of an inherent relationship between the prevalence of abortion and its legal status. This is important because they're not just saying, of course, if you outlaw abortion, you'll decrease it, but there's always going to be some people who still seek it and it's dangerous, and we have to think about that. That's one argument. That's not their argument. They're saying there's no relationship. They're saying if you outlaw it, you don't decrease it, it's the same. And if you look at the kind of work they're doing, this was much more recent, 2016 in The Lancet, what they do is they divide the world into these regions, and then they look at their abortion rates, the number of abortions per 1,000 women. Green is low, red is high. And then if you open this report and you go to table 4, they break down the abortion rates by the legality in each country. So here you have very restrictive. These countries' abortion is illegal unless her life is in danger. And the rate is 37 abortions per 1,000 women. And here you have very elective. At least in the first trimester, in these countries, you can get an abortion for any reason, and the rate is 34 abortions per 1,000 women. And so they have a conclusion like this: we did not observe an association between the abortion rates and the grounds under which abortion is legally allowed. So Guttmacher is slick enough that they're not going to directly say there is no relationship, but they will say we didn't observe a relationship between them, and then the media reports will say there's no relationship. In fact, I'm not going to go back now, but one of those reports actually said that abortion rates decrease when you legalize it, which is not what Guttmacher said, but that's how far they'll take it. The problem with this, if you know anything about data collection, is you have to control your variables. If you're trying to find a relationship between two variables, you have to make sure there aren't confounding issues, like some of these, for example. What about the religious beliefs? What about the wealth and education in the country? What about contraceptive access? Are they the same between these two groups? If not, maybe that's making a difference in the rate. And most importantly, what about unintended pregnancy rates? The pro-choice side correctly points out all the time that if we can decrease unintended pregnancy, we can decrease abortion. And I don't think anyone on our side disagrees with that. Of course, there's a relationship between pregnancy rates and abortion, but Guttmacher didn't talk about that in their study. And that's pretty important, and I'm going to spend a minute making sure you really understand why. Let's say that country A has a low unintended pregnancy rate and country B has a high unintended pregnancy rate for whatever reason. And they both have the same legal status for abortion. It's accessible. You can get an elective abortion in the first trimester at least, if not more. So of these two, where they have the same access to abortion and one has more unintended pregnancy than the other, which country do you think will have more abortions? B. Of course it's B. I don't know anybody who will argue with that on either side. Let's do the reverse though. They have the same unintended pregnancy rate. And country A has accessible abortion, and country B, it's very restricted. You cannot get it legally unless your life is in danger. So you have the same proportion of people who might want an abortion, and one group can access it more easily, and the other group can't. Which of these countries is going to have more abortions? Of course it's A. Weirdly, even though I just did the same thought process with you, when I say this, people act as if this is not obvious. But this is the relevant question, okay? Country A has low unintended pregnancy, which will presumably decrease abortions. But they have very easily accessible abortion, which presumably increases it. And country B is the exact opposite. Which of these countries will have more abortions? Trick question, guys. You don't know. You have to measure the magnitude of these factors, and also, if you're really being thorough, you measure the other factors I was talking about. But this is important because this is the Guttmacher study exactly. They compared the developed world, which has low unintended pregnancy and easy access, to the developing world, which is the opposite, but they ignored the unintended pregnancy rates. So they're like, look, these rates are kind of similar, but the law is totally different, so I guess the law makes no difference. That's their logic. That's just as ridiculous as if they'd done the reverse. Let's ignore the law. Look, the developed world has really low unintended pregnancy and the developing has really high, and their abortion rates are about the same. So I guess pregnancy isn't related to abortion. It's the same thought process. But you know, confirmation bias, people hear what they want to hear. They say, I guess they didn't say this. I'm just saying that's what it would be like. I guess it doesn't matter. Let's look at it a little bit more closely. Now, just bear with me. I'll try to go slowly, but this is the regions they looked at, and these are the abortion rates. So I don't know how you can see it, but Western Europe had the lowest abortion rate, 15.4 abortions per 1,000 women. Eastern Europe was the opposite, okay? Green is low, red is high. This is their unintended pregnancy rates. And as you might expect, the lowest abortion rates were correlated with low unintended pregnancy rates and vice versa. But that's not the interesting part. We all expect that. What's going on in the middle? Look at Eastern Africa. They have 122 unintended pregnancies per 1,000 women, and yet their abortion rate is lower than Eastern Asia, right here, which had only 47.4. Why is that? Now, this study also looked at the percent of unintended pregnancies aborted, okay? And you can see here, in Eastern Africa, which has a lot of unplanned pregnancy, only 27% of them ended in abortion. In Eastern Asia, which doesn't have that many, 78% ended in abortion. So in Eastern Africa, lots of unplanned pregnancy, most of them not getting abortions. Eastern Asia, not so much, but when they do, they're very likely to abort. And they have these comparable abortion rates. Why do you think the percent of unintended pregnancies aborted is so variable? What might make that happen? Here is the law, okay? So here, this top one is the unintended pregnancy rate, the bottom one is the law. So for example, here's North America, Australia, doing pretty good, Europe, low unintended pregnancy, good job. And they also have very little restrictions on abortion, okay? Opposite here, South America, Africa, lots of unintended pregnancy, really restricted abortion. It's the exact same thing as the hypothetical I just showed you, exactly the same thing. So here we see the same pattern in the United States. I know this is too small to read. That's the 50 states in DC. Green is low, red is high. New York has the highest abortion rate, 28.9 per 1,000 women. This is before they liberalized their late-term abortion. Here is the unintended pregnancy rate, and you can see it's kind of the same thing, where the lower abortion rate states have less unintended pregnancy and vice versa. And again, just like internationally, there's all this variability in the middle. Lots of variability on unintended pregnancy rate, but their abortion rates are comparable. Now, here's the law. So follow me here. Red is more restrictions, so think of red as a pro-life state, and green is fewer restrictions, think of it as pro-choice. And you'll see in the middle, there's all this variability. And so you have places like New Hampshire and Oregon, which have low unintended pregnancy rates and easy access to abortion. And they're mixed right in there with places like Mississippi and Louisiana, which have high unintended pregnancy rates and really restricted access to abortion. And these states all have comparable abortion rates, because of just like what I was telling you before. But here's the more important part. In general, the lowest abortion rate states have low unintended pregnancy and highly restricted access to abortion. And in general, the places with the most abortions have high unintended pregnancy and easy access to abortion. Because, of course, unintended pregnancy matters. Of course, we want to decrease unplanned pregnancies. And the law also matters. Here it is in terms of the map, if that makes it easier. California has a lot of abortions. New York has a lot of abortions. They also have very few restrictions. And then Middle America, in general, not so many abortions, lots more restrictions. And there are some exceptions. There's some anomalies that you'd have to look closer at the data, but the broad aggregate trends are very clear. And I'm not the only one who's noticed. So this is Rewire News, an abortion advocacy blog. I recommend, by the way, if you're going to get really into this debate, that you read pro-choice sources. Make sure you know what they're saying, what they think, and if you have a good rebuttal or not, and think about it. You don't want to only hear stuff from our side. Anyway, not long after I created this presentation, I was a little bit flattered to see that Diana Green Foster, who is one of the authors of some of this research I've been showing you, she said, she's an abortion rights advocate, stop saying that making abortion illegal won't stop people from having them. And she looked at the same international Guttmacher data that I just showed you, the same stuff, and she said the same thing. The average number of abortions is roughly the same between these two sets, 34 and 37 per 1,000 women, but what is not the same is the demand for abortion. The unintended pregnancy rate is way higher in countries where abortion is illegal. So she's pointing out the same flaw I am. You look at the Guttmacher data, and then the media talks about it as if this is the final say, and they're ignoring hugely important factors that make it clear that the law is obviously making a very big difference. And lest my hand-wavy, colorful graphics aren't enough for you, there's also plenty of peer-reviewed research to show the same thing. It's just not as fun to read. But this is all in the sources handout if you do want to read it, and every single one of these is research just for the United States. often looking at a single place before and after a law was passed. And they all find that when you restrict abortion, and I don't even mean outlaw abortion, I mean parental notification, waiting periods, simple things like that, the abortion rates go down. And when I point this out to people, a lot of times they say, well, the legal abortion rates go down. You're measuring legal abortion, but if they're going and getting illegal abortions or abortions in different states and you're not measuring that, it just looks like it's going down, but it's not. I get that. That's actually not what they're measuring. A lot of times they're measuring the fertility rate. You can have a secret abortion, you can't have a secret birth. And so they find that when you outlaw abortion, the birth rate increases because more pregnant people are not getting abortions. And they estimate, in the absence of anti-abortion laws, fertility would have been 5 to 12% lower in the 20th century. People act as if there's no possible way we could really know for sure. Yes, we can. There are definitely ways you can measure it, and we definitely know that when you pass abortion restrictions, abortion rates go down. There's also colloquial individual anecdotes to talk about this. I didn't put them in here. I saved them, though, in case I have these conversations, where someone will talk about how they got an abortion because they could, but if it hadn't been that way. And they're trying to advocate for abortion rights. They'll say, if it wasn't so accessible, I might have had that child. And I'm like, I know. So thank you for making my point. Anyway, so in conclusion, media accounts of 1 or 2 studies that don't control for their variables, that the journalist writing about often doesn't understand anyway, are not as persuasive as decades of peer-reviewed research or just taking the exact study they showed you and looking at it more closely. And what we find, and this should not be controversial, is that when you make something harder to do, fewer people do it. So I know that a lot of times when we are advocating against abortion, we feel like we're coming up against this wall of sort of these very powerful and persuasive and certainly loud cultural voices saying that everything we think is stupid. They think that we don't know anything about biology, we're ignorant, we don't know how the law works, we don't know how people work, we have no real life experience, and we have no empathy, and we so on and so forth. And sometimes that can feel kind of overwhelming, but just know that if you took the time, and I don't expect everyone to, but if you really dig into it, there's nothing of substance here. This is anger masquerading as fact. And we need to address that anger, and we need to find a way to communicate with people, but don't let them make you feel as if you don't know what you're talking about, because we are right about this. Again, I'm not talking about opinion. I'm not talking about personhood and fetal value and bodily autonomy. Right now, I'm just talking about these 3 ideas, which I have to argue about all the time. Biologically, we know exactly when human life begins, and we have since way before Roe v. Wade. It begins with the zygote. Most late-term abortions are not for medical reasons. Super uncomfortable reality, still reality. And the law makes a difference. The law makes a big difference. And that doesn't mean everybody that's in the pro-life movement needs to advocate for the law. There are lots of hats and lots of things that we need to be doing. And if that's not where your heart is, that's fine. But just know that it does matter, and it's an important part of the overall strategy. Anyway, this is where you can find us. If you know people who aren't super religious, send them to us. We love it when we meet people who tell us that they were kind of on the fence and they didn't know if there was a place for them, and then they found us and they felt like they could do it. And you don't have to be non-religious to join us. We have many religious allies. We don't really care what you believe. We just care if you want to advance secular arguments. And if you have any questions or arguments, if you don't agree with something I said, you can email me right there and I will be happy to argue with you about it. So that is it. And I think I was hoping we'd have time for questions, but I talked too long. So I have 3 minutes. Does anybody want to ask me anything? I don't have a microphone, so you're going to have to yell.
Yeah, I think I talked well. One thing I noticed on your list of the least restrictive states, you didn't have, I couldn't see New York up there. That's because New York is to the right with post-birth abortion.
New York was on there. I know it's hard to see. They actually have the highest abortion rate in the country. Yep. So, not super surprising, I guess.
Do you know what the worldwide abortion rate is in a year, all of the whole world?
The worldwide abortion rate in a year, I don't. I'm sure we could find out, but it would probably be really depressing. Anybody else? Red jacket.
Do you have any data on illegal abortion?
I have not personally dug into it enough. Do you mean in the United States? Sorry, her question was, do you have data on illegal abortion? Do you mean in the United States?
Yes.
I have not dug into that enough myself. One of the concerns to be aware of is that if Roe v. Wade is overturned, and if we do make this a lot harder to do, there's definitely a rise now in medication abortion, And I don't know if you've seen, but there's also a push to make that available over the counter. And so the idea of the back alley coat hanger abortion, that's a bogeyman. If people are going to get illegal abortions, it's not going to be coat hangers, it's going to be medication abortion. And that's a whole other thing, and I haven't had time to really dig into it, but that's something to be aware of. Anybody else?
Just to Ireland legalized abortion. It was legal for the first time in 2019, and abortion rates trebled. So,
Sorry, are you talking about in Ireland, you said?
yeah, just to say that it was illegal before. People had women traveled to England for abortions, and then it was made legal in Ireland.
Right.
And abortion rates trebled.
So she says that in Ireland, abortion was illegal. It was legalized in 2019, and now they've tripled? Yep, that's, sorry to hear it, but that's not surprising. Black shirt.
So if 80% of people are against late-term abortion, why are Democrats holding on to it so tightly?
Because,
Is it just
okay, the question is, if 80% of people are against late-term abortion, why are Democrats holding on to it? And I'm about to answer my opinion. You'd have to get them to talk to you honestly about it. But my belief is that Republicans and Democrats are more partisan now than ever. And abortion is one of the most partisan issues. And people care a lot about what they call symbolic beliefs. So like when you look at those polls and they say, do you think abortion should be legal for any reason in the third trimester? And 20% of people say yes. I don't actually believe 20% of people believe that. They know that when you're asking these different questions, their team is more likely to say one answer than the other. And so they go with what they think their team would say. And it's playing out like that on the national stage. I think Democrats are holding on to it because pro-choice activists, which is distinct from average pro-choice Americans, totally different groups, okay? Pro-choice activists will call any pushback on abortion an attack on women's rights, misogyny, and so forth. And they're quite good at it. The pro-choice side has very effective PR, and also they donate enormous amounts to political campaigns. So, did you have a question?
I sort of have a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
Comment too on how they'll oppose anything that might oppose the pro-life cause.
Yes.
Including the fetal pain study.
Yes. So he's saying the Democrats will oppose anything that might support the pro-life cause at all. Very quick anecdote because we're over time. Just last month, a journal article came out, Journal of Medical something, I'll have to find it for you guys. In fact, I think I link it. And it's called Reconsidering Fetal Pain. And it says basically that we've up till now said that fetal pain doesn't happen until 24 weeks. It might be as early as 13 weeks, actually. And the important thing to know about this, I talked to the author, one of the authors of this journal, and I was like, this is an amazing article. You did such a good job. How did this happen? How did you get it published? And he said the first place they submitted it to, one of the anonymous peer reviewers said, we shouldn't publish this because it'll give too much credence to the anti-abortion viewpoint. Okay? Which frankly, I'm not surprised about at all. Peer review is a terrible system. It's just better than nothing. But there's bias, not just with politicians, but with scientists too. The scientific method is awesome. I love the scientific method. Scientists are humans. They have their own political and philosophical views and biases too. And they are the ones conducting peer review. And so there are a lot of people, they didn't even want to publish a peer-reviewed scientific journal article about fetal pain. It wasn't advocating for abortion one way or the other because it would support the pro-life viewpoint. So imagine the pressure if you're a presidential candidate and you're spending millions of dollars trying to get into the White House, and this is one of many issues, and you've got Planned Parenthood and NARAL and other advocacy groups saying that if you say it should be rare, if you say abortion should be rare, then you don't support abortion enough. If you say there should be restrictions in the third trimester, which Tulsi Gabbard is the only one who has said that, you don't support abortion enough and you don't understand us. It's not even enough to say that it should be legal but sad. You have to say that it should be legal and morally neutral or celebrate it. Right. They're under enormous pressure to be that way. Who knows if personally they really even believe the things they're saying? Who knows? But I think that's why they do it. And I think also they benefit from a vastly ignorant American public. People say they're against this, but they also believe it's not happening. They also believe that it never happens unless it's for medically necessary reasons. And so they're okay with what their party is doing because they don't think it makes any major difference. Yes?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. No.
We appreciate.
Okay.